All agricultural soils in Europe face a couple of challenges, of which one is the loss of organic matter that is currently discussed a lot, but there are plenty of others, including soil erosion, salinization, acidification, compaction, and not to forget contamination or sealing. But there are really, there is a full array of them. And one of the key challenges, we could say, is the loss of organic matter. And this is also due to the fact that typically soils with higher organic matter content also show a better soil structure, which makes them more resilient against erosion or also against compaction. They typically also show higher biological activity and in overall, let's say, more favorable chemical properties for plant production. So it's also not very surprising that we see, at least in the low range of soil organic matter contents, an increase in yields, typically with higher organic matter content. So this very nice study from Emily Oldfield, who was published in 2019, shows that up to about 2% of soil organic carbon, which is about 4% of organic matter, we see an increase in maize yield if we correct for N-fertilization, climate, and so on. Yeah, so this just as an introduction to why maybe soil organic matter increasing is one of the major soil challenges we face, but surely not the only one. And as you all, or we all know, that soil management is actually key to tackle this wide array of soil management, of soil challenges. So there are management options or practices that may be helpful to tackle certain challenges, but maybe they will also lead to an increase in other soil threats. So it's always kind of a trade-off between addressing different aspects or different soil threats. So what we did in ISOMPI is we set out to create an inventory of management practices that are relevant for European farming systems. And we were summarizing the impacts of these practices, let's say, more on a qualitative level, not so much in a quantitative way. And we also assessed the current adoption of quite a long list of soil management practices in Europe. So how did we do that? So our first method or first approach was we had partners in all 24 EJP soil countries, which you see on the right of the slide. And so we were able to get information on soil management practices that are widely applied, and also information on how often they are applied from these countries. And additionally, we reviewed former European soil research projects that focus on agricultural soil management, where you see the logos on the right-hand side. Maybe you're familiar with some of them. So these were basically the two sources of information that led to the inventory that I'll talk about in the next few minutes. So as I said, our inventory of management practices basically gives an overview about soil management practices that are able to address one or multiple soil challenges. We also addressed, and it also contains information about how is the current level of adoption of these practices. And furthermore, the inventory also allows to identify practices to tackle certain challenges that might occur in a given region. So what does the inventory contain? So after going through all this literature, through these projects and talking with experts in the different countries, we came up with this list of 67 soil management practices, of which most are either tillage and traffic practices, crops and crop rotation practices, practices related to organic matter and nutrient management. And then we have a few more practices that include management options related to water, to crop protection, to landscape elements, to farming system approaches, as well as to decision support tools, so that you have a bit of an idea of what is in there. And then additionally, as I said, we also assess the impact of these soil management practices. And here you see the different soil challenges that we addressed or that we actually were looking for. So, and if again we go back to carbon, we see that from the, I think it's 53 management options where we do have this information. So from this 53, there were 30 practices that were set to tackle the topic or the challenge of maintaining or increasing soil organic carbon. And for other challenges, this looks pretty different in some cases. For example, there are not so many practices that are addressing the challenge of soil salinization, as you see on the very bottom of the chart. So this inventory that I talk about is published in a journal publication that will be available in the near future in the European Journal of Soil Science. But additionally, and probably more important in this context, is we also produced a web application that is available on the servers of our partners from Belgium. And you see the link on the top right, where basically all this information that I talk about here and much more is available. So if you go to this link, you will find a website that allows you to go through these 67 practices, find definitions and descriptions of them, also a summary of the impacts that they might have. You'll have a search function there to search for practices that address certain challenges. For some of the practices, there is also information about the current level of their adoption across Europe. And there is also information about what are the biophysical limitations of these practices that are in the inventory. So not all practices are applicable everywhere, maybe due to the climate, due to the soil, due to the topography, or due to other reasons. So one use case of this inventory is basically you go to the website, you filter for a certain soil challenge. For example, here in this example, for maintaining optimal soil structure, and then every practice that is beneficial for this would show up in a list. And from this, you then can select one or multiple and have a further information on these practices, including, for example, this level of applications in the map. And additionally, not available on the web app currently are pictures and also further literature on these practices. But for copyright and other issues, we didn't publish that freely available. So you would need to contact us and we can see if we can share it with you. So maybe a few words on what we found while doing this research. So for most of the soil management practices in this inventory, it seems that their level of adoption is currently either low across Europe or very heterogeneous. So both of it actually suggests that there is quite some room for improvement in the level of adoption of these practices to tackle the soil challenges that we talked about earlier. And so here you see two examples of the level of adoption of cover cropping, and let's say the brighter areas is where the adoption is more is higher, whereas the darker and the bluish areas it's lower. So on the left you see the example of cover crops, and on the right you see an example of reduced tillage. And here it's important to mention that this data that is shown here is from 2016 and was gathered by Eurostat. So it's not very recent, but it probably still gives a good idea about how the patterns look across Europe. And if we now dive a bit more into why are certain things or certain practices applied in certain parts of Europe and not in other parts, that's also something we looked at. So, and we basically, based our hypothesis and our research on the theory of diffusion of innovations from Rogers, who I think in the beginning looked at how farmers in the US would adopt hybrid seeds for corn. Now we basically took the same framework, so to say, to study how adoption of soil management practices might diffuse in Europe. And so we came up with this concept that current or business as usual would lead to the adoption of certain practices up to the level where it is either hindered by the biophysical limits, so by the climate, for example, or by the slope of the areas or whatsoever, or on on the other hand, it could also be limited by socio-technical barriers, which includes socioeconomic considerations like if a certain practice is viable economically. And so if we want to increase the application or the adoption of certain practices, we need to first know what are the limits and the barriers to the application, and then come up with measures to increase the level and to be able to overcome these barriers. Or in the case of biophysical limitations, like we see them on the right-hand side for cover cropping. So here we assess the climatic suitability for cover cropping in Europe, and we see that in many areas, especially in the north, in the south, and in the east of the continent, it's not so easy to grow cover crops after wheat, because typically the growing season is not so long, or there is not enough available water. So if we want to grow cover crops in this region, we need to come up with innovative solutions how to do this. So for example, it's an option to underseed cover crops in the north to make more use of the warm season, whereas in the south and the east, other options will need to be evaluated. But we don't go into further detail in this. It's just an example of climatic limitations to the application of soil management practices. So, and with this, I'm already at the end of my presentation. So to summarize, we propose basically an approach to tackle soil challenges in different regions of Europe by first identifying the regional soil challenges, which is typically done in national or regional soil strategies. And then in the next step, identifying promising management practices. And I think in this step, our inventory can be of use or can be a reference. And then another thing which is very important, which I haven't talked much about, but Roberta will later talk about this, then it's a very important step to evaluate the synergies and trade-offs if the adoption of certain management practices is enhanced. So the question really is, if we, let's say, address soil organic carbon levels, do we, with this approach, also lead or enhance or benefit other soil challenges, or is there a trade-off between addressing these different challenges, or also other goals of agricultural production like yield or farm income? And then we need to know the current level of adoption, identify potential socio-technical barriers that limit the adoption of practices, as well as the biophysical limits that basically limit the current or the potential area of application. And then the next and probably the most crucial step is then to take measures to foster the adoption if socio-technical barriers are the main issue, or innovation if the biophysical limits are really the problem of or the issue at hand in increasing the level of adoption in a certain region. So with this, I'm already at the end. So I'd like to thank all the partners that were involved. And you see, these were many institutions from across Europe. And probably you know one or a few of these institutions also within your country. So I think this is also a good first step. If you want to make use of this inventory, you could contact the persons that were involved in your country within the work that we did here in ISOMP. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now looking forward to hear and read your questions. Thanks.